Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session of the Archival Encounters lecture series, a series of talks and conversations that will take place over the fall of 2020. The series brings together scholars, writers, artists, and cultural creators to discuss the limitations and imaginative possibilities of engaging with colonial archives. Today, I have the pleasure to host this conversation between Vaughn Belle, Tami Navarro, Hadiya, and Tiphanie Yanique, who together formed the US Virgin Islands Studies Collective. They will be discussing various ways of approaching the legacies of Danish colonialism in the US Virgin Islands, based on their collaboratively written essay, Ancestral Queendom, Reflections on the Prison Records of the Rebel Queens of the 1878 Fireburn in St. Croix. This essay was published this year in a special issue of the Nordic Journal of Information Science and Cultural Mediation, entitled Archives That Matter, Infrastructures for Sharing Unshared Histories, which I had the pleasure to co-edit with Søilen and Katrine Dirckinck-Holmfeld, who is also joining us today. The conversation will be moderated by Cynthia Oliver, who's a longtime collaborator of the collective. So thank you so much to all of you for joining us today and for sharing with us your ongoing work on the colonial archives of the United States Virgin Islands. Before we begin, I will briefly introduce each one of you and then pass on the word to Tiphanie, who will introduce the essay to kickstart the conversation. Vaughn Belle is an artist who works in a variety of disciplines, from painting to installation, photography, writing, video, and public interventions. She's a co-creator of I Am Queen Mary, the artist-led groundbreaking monument that commemorates the legacies of resistance of the African people who were brought to the former Danish West Indies. Belle holds an MFA from the Instituto Superior de Arte in Havana, Cuba, and an MA and BA from Columbia University in New York. She's a fellow at the Social Justice Institute at the Barnard Research Center for Women at Columbia, and her studio is based in the Virgin Islands. Tami Navarro is Associate Director of the Barnard Center for Research on Women, Columbia University, and editor of the journal Scholar and Feminist Online. She holds a PhD in Cultural Anthropology from Duke University, and she's currently at work on a manuscript entitled Virgin Capital, Financial Services as Development in the US Virgin Islands, which explores the way in which neoliberal initiatives that advocate the freeing of markets build upon and often lead to the entrenchment of existing processes of racialization. She has published in journals such as Cultural Anthropology, American Anthropologist, Transforming Anthropology, and Feminist Anthropology. Hadiya is a research fellow in the African and African American Studies program at Stanford University and a visiting scholar at the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice at Brown University. Sue earned her PhD in Africana Studies at Brown University, and their scholarship focuses on environmental justice and Africana decolonial, feminist, queer, and political theories. They are currently working on 2 monographs titled Decolonial Desires, Race, Power, and Philosophies of Freedom in the US Virgin Islands, and Meditations on Disaster, Climate Injustice, COVID-19, and the Coloniality of American Power. As a community-engaged scholar, Sue is also the president and co-founder of St. John Co., the St. John Heritage Collective, a land rights and cultural heritage preservation nonprofit in St. John, US Virgin Islands. Tiphanie Yanique is an award-winning novelist and poet. She's co-editor of Another English, Anglophone Poems from Around the World, and the author of the poetry collection Wife, which won the 2016 Bocas Prize in Caribbean Poetry, and the United Kingdom 2016 Forward Felix Dennis Prize for her first collection. Tiphanie is also the author of the novel Land of Love and Drowning, which won the 2014 Flaherty Dunham First Novel Award from the Center for Fiction, the Thewles Wheatley Award for Pan-African Literature, and the American Academy of Arts and Letters Rosenthal Family Foundation Award. She's also the author of a collection of stories, How to Escape from a Leper Colony, which won her a listing as one of the National Book Foundation's 5 under 35. She's a professor in English and creative writing at Emory College of Art and Sciences. Cynthia Oliver is an award-winning choreographer, performance artist. She holds a PhD in performance studies from Tisch School of the Arts at New York University. Her ongoing research is in the areas of intersection between contemporary dance, feminism, Black popular culture, and the expressive performances of Africans in the diaspora, with an emphasis on the performance in the Anglophone Caribbean, particularly the US Virgin Islands. She's the author of Queen of the Virgins, Pageantry and Black Womanhood in the Caribbean, published by University Press of Mississippi in 2009. She's professor of dance with affiliations in gender and women's studies and African American studies And she currently serves as Associate Vice Chancellor for Research and Innovation, Humanities, Arts, Related Fields at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to your thoughts and discussions.
Thank you so much. The 1878 Fireburn of St. Croix is one of the foremost events in the Virgin Islands cultural memory. It produced our most beloved heroines, the four queens who are the subject of our essay and our talk here today. Queen Mary being the most popular among them, with folk songs and a highway and a monument all in her honor. However, beyond the legend, there is not much really known about the specific event, the social, political, or economic circumstances leading up to it, or to the people who participated in what can be said to be the largest labor rebellion in Danish colonial history. The prison records of the four women who we call the queens, who were ultimately charged and sentenced to death, and then the sentence was commuted to life in prison in Denmark. Their records have largely been hidden in the historical archive, along with all the information that is hidden there, only to emerge in 2017 during the centennial anniversary of the transfer. So for the few Virgin Islanders who were able to see the exhibit, and some of us are here in this Zoom meeting, this was a profound moment for us, a moment where collective memory and historical record were able to collide, challenging both the memory and the record and sparking new questions, which we wanted to address. And this article is motivated by the need to continue to explore not only the archive, but also the archival access and the nuances of archival interpretation and intervention that we think is made possible by our interventions. This text aims to extend our interventions beyond national boundaries in order to complicate the engagement with the archives, but also to disseminate the knowledge to share in this conversation with a wider group of people, actual, potential, and imagined. Each of us, four writers, used our own intellectual training, and we will each present a little bit about what we did. We use our background, our scholarly background, our artistic background, our education background, to make our own specific intervention. And as a result, the article moves tonally from scholarly to memoristic, while also being informed by our collective conversations and context as the Virgin Islands Studies Collective, VISCO. This methodology is actually central to all of VISCO's work and essential to the work that we do ongoing in the region and throughout the world. So I'll now turn it over to our first presenter to describe her material, and we'll go from there.
Thank you. Yeah, so my piece ended up going first, although it's important to say that what Tiphanie just said is very true, that central to our practice, our writing practice, our intellectual practice is collaboration, right? So we sort of wrote everything alongside one another with conversation. We write individually, but we're sort of talking through things as we go. And then at the end, we sort of think about how it would flow in terms of organization, right? So my contribution was entitled Through a Glass Darkly, Tracing Black Life in the Danish West Indies. And it went first only because it was the more historical of the contributions, right? So it gave kind of a survey of some of the major dates that one would want to be familiar with, right? So when was Fireburn? When was emancipation? What is the kind of structure of the Danish plantocracy? So my contribution does a bit of that work, sort of laying out the historical realm, but it was actually a departure for me as I went on, because I am a cultural anthropologist. That's my training and practice. But this, what do I call it, experiment allowed me to kind of delve into something I've been dealing with more, which is autoethnography, right? So instead of just sort of giving the historical record and talking about how Virgin Islanders interpret this material, receive this material, it had a lot to do with affect. So I was talking through, we each took one of the prison records of these queens, as Tiphanie said. I had Queen Agnes, and I sort of honed in on one of her possessions, which was a pair of earrings. And I walked through the strangeness of that to me, right? To be hauled off to Denmark, accused of crimes, and it's certain that you're not coming back anytime soon, why would one think to take a pair of gold earrings? And I use that as my sort of entry point into the essay to think through, okay, what is that line of thinking? What does that mean? And to connect it to my own experience as a young woman growing up in the Virgin Islands. And I sort of walk through memories of myself wearing gold earrings in Christiansted, where she would have left from. So it was absolutely an experimental process. And I feel like that is one of the important things that we're doing through VISCO, particularly with respect to the archive, because it's true that so much of this material is new to us, right? It's not new historical material, but it's new to us, either having been relatively recently translated or just issues of dissemination, which is something that we talk about all the time in this group and in our individual work, right? That Virgin Islanders don't have often access to this material. Either there's linguistic barriers or just technological barriers, right? It's not out there amongst the people in the ways that these folk songs are, right? So I'll let Hadiya talk about her bit, but in her contribution, she talks a bit about how everyone of a certain generation could sing you a stanza of the Queen Mary folk song, right? But the archival, the prison records, far less so. So I'll leave it there, but I will just say that this has been both fun and I think an important intellectual intervention because it allows us to think through creative ways that we can engage with this archive that isn't widely available. Thanks.
Yes, thank you for that introduction, Daniela, and also Tiphanie and Tami. So my piece, of course, primarily grappled with Queen Mary, which I had to say when I started out felt incredibly daunting for more reasons than one, but the primary reason being that Queen Mary is such a looming figure in our consciousness as Virgin Islanders. And so I titled the piece, I Too Am the Rebel Queen Mary, and ultimately it engages with the folk song in the Virgin Islands about Queen Mary as a radical figure. And I grapple with some of the questions of coloniality, the archive, but also freedom and humanity that are really important and central to us. And I won't sing any of the lyrics of this song for you because, you know, my tune isn't always what I want it to be, but I'll tell you that the lyrics do say, Queen Mary, where you gonna go bun? Queen Mary, where you gonna go bun? Don't ask me nothing at all, just give me the match and oil. And so I know that this song plays a very constitutive role in who we are and also our consciousness as Virgin Islanders. And we hear it and we play it and we sing it both in the public and the private sphere. But really what the song allows us to do is it allows us to grapple with some of the questions of power that emerge in our lives as we experience continuous colonial subjection as a predominantly Black community in one of America's insular areas. And so we are a colonized people who historically don't have access to our archives. They remain in Denmark and the United States. And so a lot of my thinking through the question of archive and power is informed by Shilma Membe and Anne-Laura Stoller. And so a part of what I ask in this piece is how does a community with limited access to its archives grapple with some of the glaring gaps in individual and collective memory? And specifically, how does the colonial inaccessibility of the archives, what are the implications of this for questions of governance, but also for the circulation of power? And so for Virgin Islanders, a part of what Queen Mary really does is that we get to start to think through what a Black immigrant working class woman's resistance might mean for disrupting white normative imperial and colonial orders. However, we also start to layer Queen Mary's consciousness as we understand it on our own consciousness as we grapple with the persistence of coloniality. And so for us in thinking through Queen Mary, we have to, or we're allowed to, disrupt the coloniality of our relationship to both Denmark and the United States of America. However, we also then have to come to terms with the limits of resistance. And so, in not being able to access the archive, but also in coming to terms with the fact that Queen Mary and her counterparts are indeed imprisoned, while many of the men of Fireburn were shot, we start to come to and work through some of our own hesitation in resistance in the contemporary moment. And so in performing Queen Mary, and even in a lot of the artwork that we see around Queen Mary, we are dealing with our concepts of the human, but we're also dealing with what we understand to be the possibilities and the impossibilities surrounding resistance in the contemporary moment as we try to figure out who we're trying to become as Virgin Islanders. And so, yeah, I'm not sure exactly who's next. I believe it's Vaughn or Tiphanie.
Thank you, Hadiya, Tami, Daniela. I'm really excited about this conversation. So I'm a novelist and a poet. I teach creative writing and literature at Emory, and my piece is informed by my work as an artist. In my piece, which is entitled Enslaved to Enthroned, I use my imagination to read into the archive what is unclear, what is suggested, what is, to be honest, entirely absent. And in doing so, I'm writing through a type of writing called magical realism, which is a tradition that has been used by colonized writers, notably from the Caribbean, Latin America, Africa, to make possible really what is otherwise seemingly impossible. And I use my own lived experience, particularly my own experience as a pageant queen, to imagine a political kinship between myself and the queen who I was assigned to, who is Queen Matilda. And I do this in order to ask questions such as, what is a queen? What makes someone a queen? What is queenliness? And what is particular to queendom in not only the Caribbean region, but really specifically in the Virgin Islands, a place that has been repeatedly colonized and over-colonized and remains an outlier in the region as a place that is still colonized. So I'm thinking through those questions, also questions of youth, questions of class, questions of beauty, and how those might fall on the actual bodies of the 4 women who are participants, who are the leaders of the Fireburn. So next is Vaughn.
Hi, thank you, Daniela and Katrine, for organizing this. Very excited to be here. This experience was very profound for me because, you know, I think as a visual artist, I probably would gesture to say probably every artist has worked with Queen Mary in some form. And of course, you know, the project that I did with Jeanette, reflects that, the project I Am Queen Mary, but many of us think through in a very imaginative way the Fireburn in general. There's many different paintings and photographs and reenactments and things like that. So to find this kind of archival record and be able to work through it was very significant. For me in my piece, I think I was grappling most with this idea of, you know, my piece first starts off with 5 different titles. It's kind of thinking through these ideas of renaming, because I think in many ways, what we're doing with the archives is we're kind of renaming and reclaiming it and transforming it through our collective memory. And so I come with this question of, you know, as Tiphanie mentioned, that our queens are different from the queens, let's say in Europe. These queens are not born, they're made. And you know, when thinking about the fact that the records are so different from our collective memory. For example, you know, one of the things that was interesting, my queen was Susanna. She was the oldest. And what I found really interesting is that, you know, in the records, like my train of thought, sorry. There's a contrast between how we envision the queens and what's in the records. So for example, a lot of people in the Virgin Islands, we imagine the queens as kind of organizing themselves on the similar plantation and they're working together. We project an imagination where we imagine them to be collectively working together. But when we look at the records, we could see that they possibly didn't know each other, that in some ways their collectivity is a result of their criminality, the fact that they were all rounded up and charged with similar crimes, that their participation in the Fireburn in the same way that we can think of the Central Park Five or the Exonerated Five as we now know them. And so I found that really interesting, this question of, you know, so what, first of all, why do we continue to remember them this way? Why do we continue to remember the Fireburn this way, as with women as central figures, even though the records indicate that there were also men in the Fireburn? But I think for me, in thinking through, you know, the archives also kind of show us that even though there are things that we may not be able to see, that they're absent, it kind of brings into question like the process of reimagining and how significant that is. And that probably is the most essential, that's more important than what the records actually say. It's what we think and what we say about them. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I'm always so happy to see this collection of women together and what you all have to say and think about at any given time. Before I kind of dive into the material that you each individually addressed, which was fascinating and really rich, I just want to acknowledge this crazy COVID-19 moment that we're in that would require us to be in separate spaces and to have another kind of imagined experience together. So there's something about what this moment also summons relative to our relationship to archive, what we can really materially access and what we can't, what we have to imagine, that I'm wondering if this particular American global historical moment might summon something for all of you in the ways in which we are kind of separate yet together, that might be parallel to what you discovered in the archives, or how you relate to each other, how you make the work that you make together, if that's something that you might be interested or willing to address. There's something about this very kind of alienating moment that to me seems parallel to that very thing that that you all are addressing, and maybe most directly to what Vaughn was talking about at the very end. But if you might want to kind of address that before we kind of deal directly into the material.
Cynthia, I love your question. It's so awesome to be here with you also, for us. I mean, for many of us, your work is, I would say for all of us, your work is inspirational. And it feels so ridiculous that you would claim to be honored in our presence. We're honored by your presence. You know, I really want to hear what the other women think. My feeling is in some ways the pandemic reality and how it affects VISCO or our community work, I would say it's the same in some ways. I mean, I would say perhaps like being colonized people is about being in a pandemic all the time. I mean, there's something very similar to pandemonia and colonia that seems connected. So, you know, we've always been often in separate places. That's not new for us members of VISCO. We have been meeting on other apparatus from the very beginning, sometimes finding ourselves in the same place in Copenhagen or New York, quite often not finding ourselves in that way. So we, you know, before we discovered Zoom, we were doing other things. So for us, this feels, I think, pretty standard in how we have worked together. And then finding ways to overcome the distance and find collectivity has always been what we've been doing. So this doesn't feel any more challenging than it always has been, which might say something about resilience always being part of the revolution, perhaps.
I would just say that for me, it speaks to the importance of forming community, right? And so what Lavon was talking about is these women sort of finding themselves in community and us understanding them as a collective, but perhaps that's not how they lived or even imagined their organizing, right? Their role in the Fireburn. What I would say about the ways it connects to this present moment is something, when we first read these prison records, which I think it's important for us to mention, this is the first time that they've been translated into English and folks have been able to work with them in this way. So when we were able to actually access the material, what struck, I think all four of us, we were reading this and the first thing we said was, these are all mothers and we're all mothers, right? We identified with these historical actors immediately, right, on the page, just thinking about how we all came together as Black women, as mothers, doing this work in our respective fields. But what I would say is, again, into the realm of autoethnography, for me, what this current moment of the pandemic has laid bare are the multiple burdens that are placed on Black women. I mean, think about this moment of anti-Black violence on mothers. I mean, it's unbelievable, the kinds of labor that people are expected to do, and also, right, their professional, their real work, their real interventions, right, with scare quotes. And those are some of the same burdens that these women were struggling with. I think it was Tiphanie who wrote about her queen being in the record. It was mentioned in her penal record that she was a bad mother, right? She had been charged with abusing her children or neglecting her children, and also being a bad citizen, right? Or a bad colonial subject by participating in this uprising. And it feels to me very familiar, right? That kind of bind of the weights of mothering, the weights of one's paid labor, the weights of one's unpaid labor. And that bind is really pronounced, I would say, for a number of us in this moment of COVID-19, for sure.
And also, I think to add to that, in addition to the question of motherhood and how that allows us to, in some ways, speak across time and space with the queens of Fireburn, I also think a lot of Gertrude Gonzalez Allen's work and the sediments and layers of coloniality. And so in some ways, how we understand the colonial order, but also this pandemic as being multiple layers of disasters, quote unquote, but also what they might mean for the earth itself, but also for us as human beings. And so I say that to say that I don't know how to think about Queen Mary, Queen Agnes, Queen Matilda, and Queen Susanna without also thinking about the contemporary moments, uprisings as responses to both George Floyd's killing, but also especially grappling with the aftermath of the killing of Breonna Taylor. And specifically, how do we understand Blackness in the past, but also the present and also the future? And what might it actually mean for us to organize across time and space, but also to be continuously influenced by the resistance of some of our precursors, while also continuously grappling with the pervasiveness of anti-Blackness and Black death, and how the pandemic in particular becomes one iteration of these multiple processes and conditions and policies by which Black people and Black mothers and Black women in particular are constructed as expendable and therefore rendered amenable to death in ways that are not easy in any way, shape, or form to have to come to terms with, or to have to continue to labor in spite of. And so I really do, of course, want to thank you, Cynthia, for this question, because I think it's a really important gateway for thinking about where we're located in terms of time, but also just in terms of like genealogies of freedom and all oppression, really.
And there's so much to be said in there for the Black imagination. And you all address that particular ingredient in each of your essays. And I'm going to get there to the specifics of each of the essays, but I have to say, reading the work, looking at the construction of the collective, there are 4 of you. There is this parallel to our queens, the mythology of our queens, the bodies of our queens, how we've constructed this, kind of this amazing 4. Did the construction of VISCO in any way mirror, parallel, consider any of this as a construction before kind of solidifying? Did you all pattern yourself after the queens? What was the construction of this particular group? The magic that came into the 4 of you being together as a group?
I think that we definitely, it's such the queen mythology is so much a part of our being that I think that it comes naturally in the way that we, especially any women that are going to work together. So yes, I think in the beginnings, we definitely wanted to make sure that we had representatives from all 3 islands. And we also wanted to try to work with people from different disciplines. But I think the group would agree that, yeah, that it was echoing the format of the queens, where most people understand that there were 3, then recently through the records, we understand that there were 4, but there's also the possibility, as I suggest in my essay, that there's a 5th queen that kind of gets forgotten because she wasn't sent to Denmark. Her name was Rebecca Frederick. And I think that also speaks to the distillation that happens in the collective memory and how communities create the memories that serve them, that kind of almost like create the archives that they need. But I just also wanted to say in response to the pandemic for myself, it's been a very productive time for me as an artist, even with all the immense labor of parenting, doing the double, simultaneous labor of that on top of, my art career. But I think that for me, it's definitely felt like a temporal and a spatial collapse. And a lot of my work that I generated during the pandemic was trying to kind of feel through what that means, that how, the past feels very much the present when you're thinking. I recently wrote this essay called The Monuments That Won't Fall. And it was a visual essay, and there was a juxtaposition of the image of archival image of a lithograph of the Fireburn with images from the Black Lives Matter protests, and they're so similar. There's so many images that I think that we've all kind of felt like where am I? What time zone am I? What historical period am I? Because it's one of the moments also that across the globe we've been simultaneously experiencing similar things. Not of course the same, but very, very, very similar. And similar collapses in our system, and similar, whether it be education or child care, or, or economics. It's revealing kind of the fragility, and I think so that fragility makes us question. So where are the things that we gather our strength from? What are the borders and the boundaries that strengthen us that we need to continue to strengthen? And I think everything has kind of been very much up in the air. I think it's a moment of reimagining, which I think is a very powerful moment to be in.
Powerful, frightening, stimulating, especially, in creative fields that depend on a kind of collectivity. So at the opening of the essay, you all state, quote, "This essay is a part of the collective continuing effort at possession," end quote. I've just been rereading, after quite a long time, Audre Lorde's biomythography, and have been thinking about the creation of ourselves through the recombination of parts, of fragments, as Lorde does with her own story. And in this essay, each of you has also stated that the archives are quite spare. So it seems to me that Virgin Islanders have managed, with or without the colonial records in Denmark's possession, of mythologizing our queen figures, and by extension, our relations to work, to rebellion, and to ourselves. So how do you see this record shifting, fortifying, complicating that which we knew, and also that which we creatively filled over time? So has this even become a part of our, kind of collective imaginary at this point, since, this archival project has probably for the most part not been kind of seen, as one of you mentioned, by the Virgin Island public en masse. But just if you could kind of talk about what the record might be doing or might be able to do, whether it's shift, fortify, complicates that which we have already creatively kind of activated.
I'll say something about that. I think it's interesting. My thinking, reading, is that it complicates the deeply held investment the Virgin Islanders have in these queens, right? So in the collective imaginations, it's three women who banded together, right, to sort of fight against these unfair wage practices. And I would say even that is a sort of nuanced, even that glossing over is a nuanced sort of engagement, right? But so people in the Virgin Islands know that there's these three women, right? And then they're in the collective imaginations, definitely three, who got together to sort of lead this uprising, which we know historically is not the case, right? So we talk about some of the complexity of that. Maybe it's 4, maybe it's 5. People get recombined over space and time and song and life ways and food ways, right? People get erased. And that's complicated, I would say. I would say that and that is a question of authority. I would say that the fact of a historical record that has now been translated into English, and we have this material to work with. And so something else I talk about in my contribution is the quantitative versus the qualitative, right? We can see in the ledgers what folks had, what the charges were against them, how many there were. And I don't know, I think it remains to be seen. We're living this history now. The investment is very deep in the Virgin Islands in this kind of triad, this mythology of the triad. And it would be my assumption that the historical fact of it, again, the quantitative, would not override the kind of stories we have told ourselves for so long about who we are and what we're capable of, what we have done, what we continue to do in thriving and surviving. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I would say that the historical fact of the archive complicates what we believe about ourselves. And if I had to take a guess, my assumption would be that the stories that we have told ourselves have become so much a part of ourselves, so deeply ingrained in who we are, in our collective identity, that I would argue that the historical fact of it wouldn't override that, because it's a different kind of value. I think those stories have now begun to serve a different kind of purpose that are almost apart from the historical accuracy of it.
And that's presuming there is a kind of accuracy in the archive anyway, because we are really kind of examining the look through someone else's eyes and how they judged and determined these women's, ideas of self or what they carried or what they represented. Did anyone else want to kind of speak to?
I did. For me, it was interesting thinking through this idea that these women were sentenced to eventually hard labor, but at the same time, they were held captive for actually several months, possibly even a few years before they were sent to Denmark. So there's this window of time that was really interesting for me, because it was like, and even after that, then they were sent away. So what I got to realize was that the Danish authorities had recognized the power of their symbol and the power of what they meant to a community. And you see that in the prison records. And that was interesting for me, to be able to recognize that what was really feared by the Danish, sorry, my kids, what was really feared by the Danish authority was what these women would inspire. This kind of rebellarium is what I use, that they would inspire more resistance. And so they literally sent them away, which I found really interesting, and how it didn't work. The records show us that didn't work, that they kind of encoded these embers inside of our psychic consciousness that we still live with today. And so that I think was surprising, like there were of course things in the records that you have to grapple with. They seem maybe contradictory to our collective memory, but then there were other things that were affirmed in other ways that we didn't imagine. Chicas, that way. This one.
I was interested in, because you bring it up, I was saving that for later, but because you bring it up, this notion of rebellarium and the attempt by Denmark to kind of quash the relevance of these women, and in their attempts to kind of prevent a kind of martyrdom which took place anyway. But also I was interested in how you talked about hard labor and the labors that these women were engaged in on a daily basis, and that a reckoning with a certain kind of hard labor will be the sort of thing that a Caribbean woman, a Black Caribbean woman at the time would offer up chups. I mean, really? If you're cutting cane every single day, what does a verdict of hard labor then actually mean? And so maybe that difficulty in terms of a certain labor is a kind of stasis, is a space where you can't do anything at all, as opposed to where you're actually physically engaged and making some kind of, seeing some kind of product of what you are participating in on a daily basis.
Yeah.
So moving on to Tami's essay. So this essay addresses what's been lost to the erasure by the Danes of our archival records. And I wondered, as I was reading it, I was wondering about what might have been gained by their absence. That you talk about the children's history textbook that figures Queen Mary, which I also think is quite extraordinary, that we have books that, unlike in many North American contexts where there's no reference to African American historical moments at all, that we have textbooks where the Queen Mary would figure very particularly. And in the instance that you offered in a really strong way, that perhaps this imagery, this insistence on her strength and the power of the Black every woman might not have been as present. Could you say something about this, the absence that created the space for us to center Black life as opposed to depending on Danish leadership to do so for us?
Yeah, thank you for that, Cynthia. I think that connects really nicely to the conversation we're having previously about the importance of these stories we tell ourselves, right? So in the absence of access to this material, which was taken from us when the Danes left after the sale to the Americans, we had to tell ourselves something, right? There is, in the absence of formal, and even that textbook that you talk about, Clear the Road, and I should just say up front that it's one of my deepest desires. That was formative to my childhood. I read it, and I think most of us in VISCO have read it. We've talked about it. That it's one of my deepest desires to do a similar updated textbook, because these kinds of, it's not just folkways and stories we tell ourselves, but these kinds of educational interventions around, these were our predecessors, these were our foremothers, this actually happened in this way, alongside some of the ways that they have been taken up in traditional storytelling forms, right? Not to prioritize one over the other, I think is so key. I think that is so key. And so reading that textbook in my early childhood made space in my mind for even a project like this, right? To know that there is value in the life of these Black people who were absolutely denigrated, right? Either enslaved, seen as expendable, as Hadiya has talked about, but holding on to that, the kind of import of these stories and experiences, which is something that we made, right? It wasn't given to us by the Danes or certainly the Americans who still own the islands, but we have made these for ourselves. And I think that's what I was talking about with thinking about the authority of the quantitative versus the qualitative, right? That we have created this for ourselves out of the scraps that we had. And they become stronger for it, right? Because we have over the generations poured into these stories, into these mythologies, our own experiences, right? So in that bit I talk about with the earrings, I'm braiding in my life story into that of Queen Agnes, right? What would I take with me if I were facing this unknown, unbelievable set of consequences, right? And for me anyway, the story becomes stronger because of that, right? Someone will hopefully read this collaborative piece and see it as an additional layer to the archive, right? With all the liberties that we've taken of imagination, of autoethnography, of artistic license, but it's something that we have to continually build. It's something that is under construction, right? And you hinted at that earlier when you were saying, Cynthia, that the archive isn't infallible. Absolutely, right? It's not infallible. It's full of holes and gaps and silences, but that is the project. That is the project in which we're engaged, right? Not just filling holes, but creating new spaces and reconceptualizing what the stories are. So it's not so much filling gaps. Some of it is filling historical gaps. What happened, when, where, to whom, but thinking the story completely differently. That's why my piece is called Through a Glass Darkly, because I don't think that we know enough about the Black actors in the Danish West Indies. And I don't mean in that knowing sense factually. I don't think we know them. I don't think we can, we have done enough to think about how their lives are so similar to ours, to talk about the kind of temporal collapse that you're talking about, Vaughn, right? Certainly we're not enslaved, but we live under conditions of coloniality. Our movements are constrained in particular ways. We're absolutely not fully represented in any kind of republic. So for me, it's something that we continue to make stronger as we go, because we weren't given any kind of formal story, right? So we've had to kind of make it up as we go. And for me, that's the value of it, right? That we can continue to sort of build upon it as needed.
One of the benefits of the availability of this archive that you mentioned, Tami, is the possibility of a virtual museum. And I wonder, would a virtual museum coming at this moment in time add to that which we've created for ourselves? You address what could be contextual support for the material, or the meaning of hairstyles or garb, for instance, that requires us, right? So that we're like we have been doing. It's kind of a match of imagination, ours to the colonial, and that we have to be authors for that. And can you speak more to that idea about, the necessity of us in that imagining for virtual?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel underqualified to address this. I almost unmuted at the same time as Lavaughn, because I know this is her kind of wheelhouse. So I'll let her take over in a second. But absolutely, what I will say is that Lavaughn always tells this great story, and I'll let her tell it, of her experience with hair ties in the archive. But there are all kinds of ways of knowing. This is what I'm saying. There are all kinds of ways of knowing that don't need to be ranked hierarchically, right? That there isn't a sort of grand means of knowing that we're going to unearth in the archive that's going to tell us who we are, right? We know who we were then, and we know who we continue to be in the eyes of those who enslaved and continue to oppress us. There's not going to be some sort of magical aha moment that reveals to us that we have been these transcendent warrior women, right? It's not coming. That wasn't written down anywhere. But we have, through context, created that for ourselves, right? And so it requires us as the authors and we are weaving it, we are making it as we go, because only we have that information, right, about what would be counted as culturally resonant or valuable, right? That folks from, and this is speaking the obvious, but that Danish record keepers wouldn't have written down in their ledgers all kinds of valuable and meaningful information about sounds and smells and paths and scenery that would mean an entire worldview, right, to someone else, to a sort of Black resident of the Danish West Indies. So absolutely, to your point, that there are all kinds of ways of knowing, and that is what we're trying to sort of, I feel as though we're scratching the surface of that with this intervention of this piece, right, trying to think about what do we individually possess as Virgin Islands women and as a collective of 4 women that we can contribute to a rendering, to a sort of reading of this archive. I don't know if Lavaughn, you wanted to say something about the virtual museum.
There were a few things that were in my, there is really something about the experience to transport your body into another space and experience that. And I think that's been very essential for me in my practice as an artist, and kind of coming also to the archives is, my trips to Denmark and being able to see the difference in the kind of archive, like the physical built archive that we were living in. Whereas here in the Virgin Islands, so much of our built environment is another kind of archive where we see sugar mills, pretty much in all of our vistas. Our towns are named after, in Danish, or after Danish royalty. And, for me, going to Denmark and kind of seeing the juxtaposition, I think juxtaposition is actually quite important in terms of building an archive, because you start to begin to literally, by putting 2 different things together to start to, or 3, but just that process of comparing, you begin to kind of ask new questions and see new things. I use that even in my own essay, thinking about this Danish coin that was minted in the early 1900s, and then happening upon this image of a reenactment in some ways of this coin in Brooklyn for the West Indian Day Parade, where women are reimagining these Greek antiquity styled women that are portrayed in this Danish colonial coin. They're reimagining them as these workers, which, for my interpretation, I very much see them as another reenactment of the women of the Fireburn. But it could also generally, just very simply see how we've, again, kind of projected our own images and stories onto the other physical artifacts. And so for me, I think that's what the virtual museum is very much about. It's also about thinking through what is left, juxtaposing it with other, whether it be narratives, objects, images, stories, and also beginning to compare some of the narratives and be able to create new ones. And to not also wait for a physical space, because, as in the Virgin Islands, we have a very difficult time. Our institutions are very fragile, especially our institutions around cultural heritage. We don't really have a lot of museums. We don't have a lot of spaces that tell our story. And so this impulse was about thinking that we don't actually need to wait for a physical space, that we can begin to do this work virtually. which of course now seems, it's very much how the world is moving. And I think there are some challenges to that too, because I think that there's as an artist who works with the materiality of coloniality, there is something very much about texture and the relationship between your body to an object and the size of the photograph, the intimacy, all those things that sometimes get lost in a virtual space. And I think that that's something that we're all navigating right now, right? Realizing the things that virtual spaces can give us, but also the things that that are lost in those interactions.
Daniela, before I go on, or before we go on, was there, because it's 10 minutes to, oh, did Katrine leave? Oh no, she's still there. Did we want to insert any questions by Katrine before she has to go?
I'll insert a question by my own. Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks a lot, and sorry for, but I just find the conversation super inspiring, and all the elements that you touched upon concerning the temporal collapse, and then you talked about reimagining, but what Daniela and I also spoke about in our introduction to the Archives That Matter special issue, and how I really somehow see your work, but also you, Vaughn's joint work with Jeanette Ehlers in terms of rematerializing the archive. And this I find super interesting, and think that is full of lacuna and lack, and on the other hand we have the Virgin Island oral history, and in a way I see your work of really somehow rematerializing these in compatible way, and also juxtaposing them and creating a third space or new spaces. So yeah, I just find the conversation super exciting, and actually what I'm missing is also to bring you back physically Denmark, and to staging this conversation, because as you also mentioned, this article was written post the centennial that sparked a lot of new conversations and a lot of new debates, despite all its all the problematics around it, and also the whole problematics of not offering access to the Virgin Islands. So a lot of the events took place in Denmark, and yeah, so I just would like to sort of resonate with what you were saying, and somehow hope that we can find ways of creating spaces, even if it has to be online, for kind of continuing the conversation, and also to somehow find ways that also then, if the conversation have to be virtual or online, how can we then reconnect the material or the textual encounter in the virtual experience?
Yeah.
But I mean, there's so much to be said. Also, another thing that I found really touching in your conversation today, and also in the essay, is this thing about how the Danish colonial regime were putting the women away to avoid martyrdom, and I see a lot of resemblance to the situation today, or like to the continuous practices that are happening today in also in relation to Black Lives Matter and the discussion in Denmark, even though it's a different conversation than the one that is going on. Just the way that it's been treated by the media, and it's been sort of trying to, there's been a lot of shaming going on and stuff like that. So, I mean, there's just so many parallels that could be interesting to continue working on.
I think one of the things I find really interesting in thinking about this idea of people being able to, or converting your body into a symbol that is kind of predicated on somehow Black death or suffering. You know, I think that there's also been some critique about that in the modern manifestation of it with Breonna Taylor or George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery, any of these individuals, that the immediate kind of also aestheticization of their image, and how there's been this emphasis to kind of, let's also remember that these are real human beings that had lives. They're not just symbols. So I think it's interesting how on the one hand, most of our conversation has been thinking about like these women who we don't know very much about, but they have become these powerful, powerful symbols. And here we are in this moment watching individuals become these kinds of symbols, and this pushback also simultaneously happening to ground them in their humanity, and to kind of resist some of what that symbols actually also does, is that we forget that they were mothers, or that these were people's sisters, and that they had also they had fears and joys, and you know, they weren't just poised as freedom. You know, like that was actually part of the critique in the Virgin Islands of our image of Queen Mary, was that the image of her and the queens of the Fireburn has always been a standing, charging, kind of permanently affixed in this defiance. And what our image is kind of, it's more reflecting her interiority. It's much more centered on her humanity. Like let a woman rest, you know, let her sit. Like there's other aspects to her humanity. So I think there's constantly this tension there.
Tiphanie, did you want to address an earlier point? You good? Okay. I wanted to kind of continue in this vein that kind of Tami had brought up about worldview and about the archive, and kind of address this initially to Hadiya. One of the repeating themes that we see in a lot of the literature, historical literature around the Caribbean and the US Virgin Islands in particular, has been this idea that there seems to be chaos happening, and suddenly out of chaos, some kind of rebellion ensues. That there is this kind of lack of a recognition of a way in which we operate as Black people, as people of color, and how we then collectively decide to move and create a certain kind of change. It is consistent across historical documents that there was chaos, there was, you know, revelry, there was something, and then out of nowhere, they rebelled. And I'm wondering if some of the questions that you bring up about Queen Mary and her existence in the collective imaginary address some of this kind of historical kind of schism. If there's a way that you might want to talk about some of that, Hadiya.
Yeah, the internet connection got a bit funky on my end, and so if I missed any aspect of the question, do let me know. And what I will say about this is a couple of things, but one being, I think sometimes that we forget that there is a very somewhat clear and pointed like genealogy of freedom in Virgin Islands thought. And a part of this happens, I think, because so much of how we understand many of our thinkers is that they are arguably situated in other spaces. And so I think of Arturo Schomburg, I think of Barbara Christian, I think of, to some extent, Nella Larson as like a descendant of the Virgin Islands, but also Hubert Harrison, Edward William Blyden. I mean, when we start to think about Virgin Islanders' contributions to global political thought and theory, but also the theorization and advocacy around anti-Blackness, we start to recognize that these are not simply isolated theories or isolated forms of resistance, but rather there's a pattern and a phenomenon really around how Virgin Islanders organize, but also think about questions of resistance and freedom, but really about humanity. And so if we understand a great deal of like Africana thought as being about recuperating and acknowledging the theoretical contributions of Black people to global thought, especially in modernity, around questions of like dehumanization and what slavery and colonialism means for how we regard people who are identified as Black, I think that a part of what we can start to trade with not only Queen Mary, but how we, even as the Virgin Islands Studies Collective, engages with Queen Mary, are particular ideas about humanization and possibility and resistance in the face of power, and specifically in the face of power that isn't always self-aware or even reflective enough about the impact of, let's say, white supremacy or even coloniality. And so in grappling with Queen Mary, as Vaughn was saying, as a symbol, but also as a human, I think a part of the question that we find ourselves asking is, what does Queen Mary allow for in our own theorizing about humanization in the aftermath, quote, of slavery, but also really in a contemporary moment that's still marked by multiple forms of liminality and continued subjection. And in some ways, it becomes a somewhat, I think, difficult question to engage with. I think in grappling with the facts of Queen Mary's life, we open up new ways for thinking about Virgin Islands identity, for example, and grappling with some of our contemporary challenges around the question of who gets to identify as a Virgin Islander and what are the implications for some of our contentious debates around identity for our capacity to be self-determined and pass a constitution, for example. And so in coming to terms with Queen Mary as an Antiguan-born Virgin Islander, we also open up space for grappling with some of our challenges around identifying what Virgin Islands identity means for political organizing in the contemporary moment. However, I think it becomes really important for us to recognize Virgin Islanders as theorists, if that makes sense. And in doing so, really start to think about, well, what are we saying from our location on what, like Sylvia Winter may call the interstices of history? And why exactly is our particular invisibility, so to speak, in the prevailing canon important for recognizing like how power functions, but also what might it actually mean if we could really theorize the human from the position of the colonized criminal woman, othered on multiple different levels and layers.
I wanted to comment on this idea of how the archives can help us think through this genealogy. And it references the story that Tami suggested that I didn't actually pick back up on. So actually I went with Katrina and we went to the National Archives, and I had been very curious. It's difficult to navigate the archives. So you kind of have to go there and ask someone who's an expert in them questions. And one of the things I was very curious about was this idea of, you know, the textiles that you would find in the ledgers that the ship captains and things like that would write back and say, for this kind of fabric, and they would have an example of the fabric, we can sell and trade this amount of African bodies. And I thought that was so interesting. And I was asking him for, is there any other references in the archive around textiles that you can think of? And he kind of thought for a moment and then said, like, oh yeah, there's this, for the women in St. Thomas, the coal carrier strike, they, in a lot of the records, you see how they're questioning them a lot about their head ties, because apparently the way that they wore it signaled that they were in a resistance movement. And he said also that they had been, you know, we know that these women were also very inspired by the Fireburn, which happened several decades before. And I remember kind of stopping him, like, wait, what did you just say? Because he said it in a very flippant way, you know, and it was like, yeah, this, and I just, that was so significant for any woman of African descent, that we understand the importance of head ties still in our culture today. And then to imagine that there was a purposeful linkage in the way that people were dressing themselves to connect themselves with this genealogy of resistance was, it just kind of made me think, like, who would we be if we knew that, if that was something that we had been able to retain in our collective memory. And it was one of the things that made me, you know, more steadfast in this idea that we need to be in those archives. Our eyes need to be in those archives. As fallible as they are, it's still a worthwhile project to engage with them.
Which is one of the things that, you know, that Tami said that I really resonate with, which is a kind of recognition that, you know, many of the eyes that were looking at these movements in the Caribbean and in the Virgin Islands in particular didn't recognize what was happening until, you know, things were already, as Tiphanie would say, ablaze, right? And so as a choreographer and someone who's kind of looks at movement and sees movement, I resonated very much with Tiffany's piece because of how you talked about the kind of reinterpretation, the flipping the script of that particular motion, the curtsy that you undertake in that. And I'm interested if you could talk maybe a little bit about you. There was one thing that you said, and I want to that you kept yourself strong as a gleaming blade. Okay, so a number of us are wearing our blades, and I'm wondering if you could talk about the representation of that, this as an iconic symbol for one, but also the way you kind of reversed a moment to present a very different kind of sense of self and what that particular action meant.
So I do want to say that this what we're doing here is a conversation about a piece that we have all worked on and written, and I know that Daniela and Katrina will somehow connect our conversation to the physical article. That will be exciting for me to see how our conversation now juxtaposes with the article itself. But in my piece, I'm going over what it meant for me, a girl from a poor neighborhood, a girl who was on scholarship at my high school, to become the queen of my school, which in the Virgin Islands, that means to be representing the school in public forums. It meant being the face of the school in the newspaper, in the news, definitely doing carnival, and just thinking through how this body became the body that represented my school. Not only was I not from the right, perhaps, class, I was a different religion than my school. The school was Anglican, I was Catholic, but also I played Pan. That was my talent that I presented at the pageant, which is not considered, even I think today, to be particularly feminine instrument to be playing. Better you sing, maybe you play the flute, but you're definitely not going to play pan for your talent, which is what I ended up doing. And one of the things that I did do that did sort of conform to the feminine ideas was I did this really difficult curtsy, which as far as I can tell, this is a curtsy, and I did all this research. It's very particular to maybe just to the versions or to the region. It's based most definitely on European ideals of a curtsy, but it takes a whole lot of physical strength to do this curtsy. And to be able to do without the help of your escort, your male escort, was a big deal. So to get down into the curtsy and then to lift yourself back up required an incredible amount of physical strength. And I practiced it when we were writing the article. I practiced it and I was like, yeah, man, this thing's still hard to do. It's hard. But just thinking through that, something that may look quite feminine and beautiful, we were all wearing these big poofy dresses, was required a kind of physical labor that we often don't think of as feminine. And I wanted to think that through alongside the women of the Fireburn, the queens of the Fireburn, as we think about the physical labor that they did every day as cane cutters, where they actually use this tool in full form to cut cane, but also in ways that Tami referenced in her piece. These women were all women who, as we all discovered when we found these archives, and it's really important that Vaughn took us through that. Like, the archives are there in Denmark, they are there in Danish, they are there in Old Danish. So they are multiply, removed from us, and that they're across the ocean, they're in another country.
And I'll just say, to Tiffany's point there, the Old Danish is key, because even when we had secured a translator, I mean, it's a very particular kind of, calligraphy style writing, and thinking about, okay, well, what is this sort of like parsing the language in a very particular way. So just to second, those layers of removal are very real.
Yeah, and we were able to engage with it. One of the first things that we noticed, all of us, in the similar way that Vaughn, being a Black woman, a mother, we noticed that the women all had their jewelry still with them in Denmark. And that, it felt incredibly particular to us for various kinds of reasons. One reason being that just to think to the fact that the four women were imprisoned in St. Croix before they left St. Croix. So their jewelry was kept on them while they were imprisoned in St. Croix. Then they were able to retain, as far as we can tell, their jewelry in the transit over to Copenhagen. And then when they arrived, it was then taken from them. But that meant that they were of such a standing in the community. And this is, to some extent, my imagination. We don't know for sure, but one may imagine that they were of such a standing in the community that they were allowed to keep their adornment. And I referenced in my essay that in the 1786, there were laws on the books at that point in the Virgin Islands, whereby women of color, particularly Black women, women of African descent, were not allowed to be adorned. They were not allowed to have physical presentations of their beauty. It was illegal to wear tulle, to wear lace, to wear jewelry, if you were a woman of African descent, in part because you were competing with ideas of beauty with the white women. And we have stuff like this in our papers where white women are literally complaining to the police about women of color being too beautiful. How dare she wear tulle and lace? And here we have these four women who seem to be wearing, what we might say might have been tulle or lace, but definitely wearing their jewelry by the time they get to Copenhagen. And so I wanted to think about them in my essay as women who are incredibly strong as machetes, but also were still human, still women. And my queen, Matilda, we were given our queen. Vaughn picked them out of a hat and just assigned them to us. My queen Matilda was the youngest queen. She was thought to be in her early 20s, but maybe even late teens. And she was the youngest of the group, which the idea that she wouldn't have still been invested in her own aesthetic presentation is ridiculous. Of course she would have been, but that's not how we see the women in our historical records, or definitely not in the Danish archives. They had face, they're angry, they're protesting, but these were also women who treasured themselves aesthetically. Vaughn actually gave me a story about potentially Queen Mary being in St. Thomas doing carnival and processing, right, in carnival, which is what our queens do, our modern day pageant queens do as well, processing carnival. So I wanted to juxtapose the two ideas. What might it mean to be a young woman in the Virgin Islands representing your place, knowing that you maybe were from the class that was not allowed to be beautiful, but what might it mean to both be a beautiful woman and to be a revolutionary? And can we hold those two things together? I also felt like something that the question you asked Hadiya, Cynthia, about the way that Virgin Islands, our revolt seemed to come out of nowhere. I thought that also connects to this idea, in my mind anyway, of pageantry. So I wonder if I could address that question from a different angle, which is that the carnival in itself is a revolutionary experiment. And it's true in our historical record that quite often people chose to go in the streets and dance as revolt, right? That revelry and revolt have the same root, revel. And it just make a bacchanal, to make a riot. Whether you do it for fun or you do it for revolt, and maybe you do both at the same time. That going out and saying, I'm beautiful, I'm gonna wear my jewelry, or going out and saying, you know, I am going to wind up and dance, that for people who are your bodies are being physically oppressed, just saying, I'm gonna dance in the street is already an act of revolution. And so the idea that for us, that yes, it can look like the revolution came out of Bacchanal, but what if we reimagine that the Bacchanal itself was part of the revolution? To be just having Bacchanalia and owning that is a revolutionary action. And that's something that I'm working through in my essay as well.
Also, one of the things that is very powerful in your essay is the way you redirect the energy of the audience coming at you, that you sense a certain sensibility in the room and you change it by understanding the values that the folks around you have, and by harnessing that particular moment. So there's something for me about what happens in a moment of revelry, or that becomes a moment of resistance, that then becomes a moment of revelation, which all take place in this particular event that you relate. Vaughn, I didn't want to cut you off.
No, I wanted to, no, thank you for adding that, because I think it speaks to what I had wanted to signal. The story that I had shared with Tiphanie about Queen Mary and the procession comes from your book. When you talk about the queens, where you kind of situate this idea of pageant queens in this larger narrative of rebel queens, and talking through Queen Mary, that section where you talk about her in St. Thomas, and then having this procession where I think it's like maybe a Carrie-So song that's referenced, where there's this mythology around Queen Mary in the Fireburn, making white women fan her, which was a very significant servile task, that then in the song and in their gestures, they're walking down the street and they're fanning themselves, and they're also directing, like, fan me, give me that kind of praise and give me that kind of dedication. And for us, that for me particular, that was very important in thinking through this idea of Queen Mary sitting, recontextualized where the monument is in Europe, where her sitting on that peacock chair was often quickly interpreted as a throne. And that was kind of like, oh, but that's not the kind of queen she is. But what I got from that story was that the Queen Mary in her own lifetime had a mythology around her of taking European symbols and transforming them for herself. And so it's almost as if I'm going to be the kind of queen for my community, and I'm going to be your kind of queen too. Like, I'm going to take that throne as well. And I think that kind of play with image and narrative and gesture is also very significant. That's also revealed through the archives and revealed through our process of re-engaging with them.
Which is also, I'm sorry, who was that?
It was Tami, but go ahead.
No, Tami, it's more important for you all to talk.
Well, no, I just wanted to say that picking up on the thread that you were talking about with Tiphanie and Vaughn, is that this conversation is also making me think about your work when you talk about in your book the role of the audience, right? That it's not that an audience in a Virgin Islands beauty pageant is not a passive force, right? That there's a lot that energy is like a wave, right? And you talk about the way that Tiphanie was able to sort of navigate it to see what's coming, but it's not a sort of passive thing where you're watching a performance. Like there's the cheering and we know who people are rooting for. And that energy is kind of constitutive of the event that is going on, right? That it's a sort of a dynamic between the people on the stage and the people in the seats. And in the same way, this takes me back to your question about how, what is the role of something like this piece? How are we contributing to this archive? It feels like we're not audience members, right? That we are co-creating something, that our presence is not a passive presence, but we're reading this, we're engaging with it, and we're speaking into it, breathing into it. We're saying, okay, and what else, right? How can our presence in these physical spaces, in these Zoom spaces today, change what we know, add to what we know, and create complexity? That it's changing, it's actively changing the knowledge that is available to intellectual communities, but I would say for all of us in VISCO, more importantly, to Black communities, right? To Virgin Islanders who can have a more thorough sense of themselves.
That's a perfect transition to, I think, Daniela, I'll ask the last question because I know we're getting close on time. But I wanted to ask all of you, what do you want to ask the archive? Like what would feed you in this discovery, in this sense of fortification, in your questioning, in resistance, and in any of the multiple ways in which you all kind of consider this particular set of human? What would you ask the archive?
I think for me, I'm constantly asking the archive who I'm in conversation with, because I know deeply that I am not operating in a silo or a vacuum. I mean, even the space that I'm in is an archive. The first registered owner here is from 1777, African-born women who survived slavery, was able to purchase this house that I'm working in. And so I know that I'm not, I want to understand better who I'm in conversation with. I think that's kind of what I'm constantly looking for. It's like a call and response. I'm asking, and I think it's more maybe the process as opposed to a very specific question, but it's that like calling out and then looking for these responses. Yeah, that's what I would say.
I referenced in my introduction to my piece that I work in this form called magical realism. I mean, that's just what the form is called, but basically the idea is that what we understand to be real is based on just how we understand the human to be made. So we might say science fiction literature really bases a lot of our understanding of the person on physical body. Are you a cyborg? Does your arm turn into a robot or whatever, right? So that's science fiction. The body itself is really important. Psychological realism is primary in American and Western literature. The idea that like what you actually experienced in your childhood is how you become the adult and person that you become. And I would say in places like the Caribbean, Africa, Latin America, maybe even parts of Asia, that belief systems that come through the community are a big part of how we understand ourselves. So something we might call social realism and magical realism is how Caribbean writers and Latin American writers and African writers tend to go to when we think about creating humans on the page, which is the work that I do, creating characters and voices in my poetry and fiction. So for me, when I think about what I would want from the archive and what I long for most is for trying to find ways to understand what people believed, what they hoped for, and what they longed for. And because I'm a writer, I think that the way that I'm most interested in accessing that, and the way that I frankly believe we might most access that, is from having the actual words of some of these people. And I don't know if that's possible. I don't know if anybody thought to record us or to put our language down. Although I actually know that people did think to record us and to put our language down. Some of those people were us ourselves. I'm looking for those things. I want to know what we actually said. I want to know what was written in the newspapers at the time. I want to know what people said in response to the newspapers. I want to know what somebody shouted as they were leaving the dock. I'm interested in people's language because I think that's maybe the most useful way for me to access their interiority and their imagination, which is how I know that they're humans. I mean, I feel like Lavon and I had an interesting conversation recently, and I don't want to go too much into it because Lavon and I might talk about it later in another forum like this, where she was talking to me about a piece of Cheney, a piece of pottery that she had found, and Lavon had one interpretation. I had a very radical opposing interpretation. And what we discovered as we were talking, mine was much more romantic and about like love and thinking through like what might have been happening inside this woman's mind, just the image of this woman on the piece of pottery, the Cheney. What we discovered through our conversation was that because when Lavon first saw the image, the woman was upright, but when Lavon had sent me the image, the woman was laying down, or is it the other way around? Can't remember now.
The picture had different, it depends on how you saw the fragment, right, what your interpretation could have been. Yeah. And literally the position of it.
Literally made it look to me like, and it was just the way that the picture had been, I had received it physically, made it look to me as if the woman was being embraced by a lover. And so my imagination just, this is a communication of intimacy. This is communication of interiority. Lavon had received the image and understood it differently, in part just because of the positioning of the image. Maybe it was one of captivity, one of estrangement, one of ownership and assault. So I saw something different simply based on the positioning. And I thought, what if there was a caption? You know, what if there was language? So for me, I'm always searching for language, which might help us gain imagination, help us gain access to the imagination of these people.
But I think what came out of that conversation was also this questioning of value and validity, because what happens when it is a fragment and we just don't know? So the most important thing really is the narrative that we say about it. That's it. That is our truth. There's things that are irreparably lost, and I think that's part of the challenge in working with the archives, that there is sometimes this sadness that there's just things that we don't know. But then the converse to that is what we know of the past is really how we narrate the past. And so it was kind of that power in the narration, the power. And I think that's what you opened up with, this question of the possession. How do we take ownership of our own stories and feel powerful enough to do that? So it was kind of like, so we asked this, but like, does it really matter what was really in the original colonial piece or is it more important what we say about it?
I was just going to say to Cynthia's question about what I would want the archive to say to me. It's so funny. I feel like this question is revealing for all our collaboration, our disciplinary biases, right? So Lavon is looking for a particular thing. Tiffany's looking for language, and I'm an anthropologist. I'm looking for ideally how people made meaning of their lives. Like, how did they actually do it, right? Not just what does the record say to us, but what are the kinds of forms of collective care, economic collectivity that enabled people, right? And we see we see sort of practices of this in the Caribbean today, right? How do they collectively pool money so that folks can have it as needed? How did people arrange childcare? Like, how did they do it? What were the actual forms that sustained their lives? Not just how did they sort of make it through enslavement and drag themselves through another year, but how did they actually inhabit their lives in ways that were meaningful to them? Because I think that that has resonance for us today, right? So again, to Lavonne's head wrap kind of anecdote, what are the things that were meaningful to them that we may in fact be practicing forms of today and just not fully understand, right? The sort of history of them, the sort of historical power of them. So I think I would want to know, and I don't know, you know, to what extent an archive can reveal that, right? Because that is such a personal dialogic thing that happens in practice. It's made daily, right? But that is the thing that I'm most interested in. How did people make meaning and make their survival possible?
And so much of that, you know, even for the moment that we're
Hadiya has to say something super philosophical.
Oh, I don't want to cut Hadiya off. We're going to get back to Hadiya. But I'm just thinking that the invisibility of a lot of that management of your day-to-day that happens, we're experiencing right now. How much of a record is there of what happens, what's happening in the surrounding room around you, you know, where your children are, how you and your partner are managing to continue your children's education while you work, and all of those things that, you know, are kind of surrounding us in the background that is or is not seen in some way. Hadiya?
See Lavonne's kids come back behind, you know. I mean, my daughter at one point opened the door and I just hoped beyond hope that she would close the door back, which she did. But you know, there's so many things happening for all of us outside of this little screen, right? This is an archive. We are right now making an archive, but there's also stuff outside that some future you know, questioner will say, well, what was happening outside of those squares?
Exactly. Hadiya?
Exactly. Also, and I think one of the things that I would add is that, one, I found it to be a very difficult question in the sense that I think the things that I truly want the archive to tell me, it's just not going to tell me. And so coming to terms with the silences and the gaps and what it means for my own trajectory as an inquirer. But I think that the question that the archive can answer for me, that I might want to ask it, is what are the vulnerabilities in the prevailing power structure? And so if the archive won't tell me as much as I want to know about the quote unquote marginalized subject, at the very least, the archive reveals such a great deal about itself and about state power, but also Denmark and the United States in particular as the Virgin Islands colonizing forces. And so part of the question that I have is, you know, not just about like subjectivity, but also about what are the weaknesses in the imperial order, and how does the record process or the production of the archive and its main tenants tell us something about the weaknesses of the state. And so in tracing like the possibility of a new imaginary, I sometimes wonder if I know enough about power as it exists currently and about how that power is then lodged in my own self-formation. And so I guess a part of what I'm asking the archive about the vulnerability of the states is asking, well, what part of the state is a part of me? And how do I understand that vulnerability as being something that produces my own individual and collective hesitations around resistance? And I think that that's a question that's possible, I think, to access in the archive.
I think it's also interesting that as you talk about the hesitations around resistance, it's the vulnerability of the state that also allowed the resistance of these four women that you all describe to exist in the first place. And perhaps those were vulnerabilities that they recognized and took advantage of. Daniela, those are my questions. I don't know if you have more.
No, at this point, I can only thank you for the gift of this conversation. I think we know this is an unfinished conversation that for now has to end, but there will be ways to continue it in many forms in the future. I would just like to use these final words to thank VISCO again for writing this beautiful essay and for opening up so much with this essay. So thank you for that. And thank you, Cynthia, for beautifully moderating this conversation and for also the gift of your book and what it has made possible. So thank you all. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It was awesome. I love these women, powerful, amazing humans. Thank you so much for inviting me to do this with you.
Thank you.